Oh, Mark, Charles de Montesquieu, what's that, a French restaurant? No, it's not. It's one of the great thinkers, great philosophers, relied on by the framers of your Constitution to give us this republic. And now, more than ever, we need to understand the history that undergirds this society, because it's being screwed up, it's being ruined. And I want you to know what virtually nobody else knows in your neighborhood, in your community, and in this country about one of the great men with one of the great minds who helped found this nation, Charles de Montesquieu, on Levin TV.
This is where freedom rings.
If you believe in America, if you believe in the Constitution empowers us. It's a new day. America's back. America's back, and America's going to get strong again. We're going to defend America, and we're going to defend our interests.
Liberty's voice, Levin TV.
Hello, America. Mark Levin here. It is Levin TV. And from time to time, as you know, I'd like us to dig a little bit more deeply into the history of this country. How did we come to be? Why are we such a miraculous place? You know, I looked over the news today and I said, it's so petty. Let's take an opportunity to use this format in the best way we can and address some of this. And this is the opportunity, I think, if you have children and so forth, call them around, because this is the sort of thing that's not taught in school. Now, one of the things I want to tell you about is a man by the name of Charles de Montesquieu. His name is longer. He had all kinds of awards and honors over the course of his life, but he was a great philosopher. But more than that, he lived from 1689 to 1755, and he had an enormous impact during the constitutional period of this country. Virtually every man at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia read Montesquieu. In particular, the spirit of the laws. The spirit of the laws, I have a copy of the book on my desk at home, on my dining room table with stacks and stacks of books about philosophers and histories and economics and so forth. And this book, in the translation, is about 1,200 pages long. But it is an incredibly important book, and I dare say the vast majority of you were not taught about Montesquieu in high school or college. And if you were, you probably weren't taught the truth about Montesquieu. So he was crucially important the way Locke was, and Cicero and Aristotle and others. But we want to focus on Montesquieu because, again, he was very, very important during the constitutional period, the most widely read philosopher at that time. The pre-constitutional period, the revolutionary period, the most widely read philosopher at the time was said to be John Locke. So let's dig in. This will be fun. If you're interested in learning about that which undergirds this country, as opposed to the usual yap, 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 yap that you'll get on cable and so forth, this will be fun. Montesquieu explains that prior to all these laws that man makes are the laws of nature. This is very, very important. The laws of nature, the state of nature, natural rights. It's in the Declaration of Independence. It's borrowed from Locke. Locke borrows it from Cicero. Cicero borrows it from Aristotle. Aristotle borrows it from the Stoics. So this goes way, way back. Greece, Rome, the Western Enlightenment, and of course, our founders. Prior to all these laws are the laws of nature, so named because they derive uniquely from the constitution of our being. To know them well, one must consider a man before the establishment of societies. The laws he would receive in such a state will be the laws of nature. The law that impresses on us the idea of a creator and thereby leads us toward him is the first of the natural laws in importance, though not the first in the order of these laws. Now, this is important. And I write about this, and this is from Ameritopia, and I write about this in Liberty and Tyranny as well. And it's this. If you look at the Declaration, if you look at the understanding of man and the civil society, before there was a constitution, before there was an America with states and a government and all the rest, they talk about the laws of nature. Now, where do these laws of nature come from? Well, they come from the state of nature. Well, where does the state of nature come from? Read the Declaration. The Creator, God, divine providence. Now, some of you might say, well, that's all well and good, but I don't necessarily believe in God or the supernatural, all these things. That's fine. You don't have to believe in anything. But our society, a civil society, was organized around the principle, around the doctrine, that there's something bigger than man. There's something bigger than lawmaking. There's something bigger than regulations and ordinances. And that is divine providence that gives us unalienable rights, each and every one of us, or what I call the sphere of liberty around each and every one of us. And even if you don't believe in a supernatural or God or have no faith, obviously that's fine, that's up to you. And in our country, that's fine and that's up to you. But that is what has created the tolerance that exists in our society. That is, unalienable rights apply to everybody, regardless of whether they believe in God or don't, regardless of whether they have a religion or don't, regardless if they have faith or don't. That is the magnificence of the principle, of the doctrine of natural law that goes back. And he goes on, a man in the state of nature would have the faculty of knowing rather than knowledge. It is clear that his first ideas would not be speculative ones. He would think of the preservation of his being before seeking the origin of his being. In other words, existence, individuality, subsistence, survival, stability comes before intellectualism and so forth, although intellectualism does come. He says, such a man would at first feel only his weakness. His timidity would be extreme. In this state, each feels himself inferior. He scarcely feels himself an equal. Such men would not seek to attack one another, and peace would be the first natural law. Not to get too complicated here, but in this he agrees with Locke, and Locke and Montesquieu disagree with Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes says the first inclination of man is war, is to conquer, is violence, and so forth. Locke says, no, that's wrong. The first inclination is survival. And through survival, getting along with people to the extent that's possible. And Montesquieu comes slightly after Locke, agrees with Locke. Montesquieu goes on, he explains, considering as living in a society that must be maintained, they have laws concerning the relation between those who govern and those who are governed. Now remember, I'm not giving you all 1,200 pages of the spirit of the laws. We'd be here for about 12 years. What I'm doing is getting into the guts of the matter that I think relates to what's going on today and that undergirds our system. Considering as living in a society that must be maintained, they have laws concerning the relation between those who govern and those who are governed. So we're moving now from the individual, natural law, and so forth, into the notion of, okay, this society, how do we govern ourselves? And he says, and this is the political right. The political right. Further, they have laws concerning the relation that all citizens have with one another. And this is the civil right. You wonder where this phrase civil rights comes from? It comes from Montesquieu. So this political right is the right to, as we'll see later, a representative government with 3 branches and so forth. And the civil right is the right that the individual has that is recognized by that government. Okay? Montesquieu wrote The Nature of Governments. He wrote about them. He said there are 3 kinds of governments: republican, monarchical, with a monarchy, and despotic. To discover the nature of each, he writes, the idea of them held by the least educated of men is sufficient. What he's saying there is, let me dumb this down so even Mark and everybody else can understand. I assume 3 definitions, or rather 3 facts. 1, Republican government is that in which the people as a body, or only a part of the people, have sovereign power. Monarchical government is that in which one alone governs, but by fixed and established laws. Whereas in despotic government, one alone, without law and without rule, draws everything along by his will and caprices. So in Republican government, Montesquieu explains, the people must be able to vote in elections. Quote, a people having sovereign power should do for itself all it can do well. And what it cannot do well, it must do through ministers. Congressmen, parliament, members of parliament, so forth. Ministers do not belong to the people unless the people name them, meaning elect them. Therefore, it is a fundamental maximum of this government that the people should name their ministers, that is, their magistrates. Montesquieu points out, quote, there is this difference between the nature of the government and its principle. The nature is that which makes it what it is, and its principle that which makes it act. The one is its particular structure, and the other is the human passions that set in motion. In other words, the one is the setting up of the institution, and the other is human beings actually functioning within and running the institutions. He explains, there need not be much integrity for a monarchical or despotic government to maintain or sustain itself, because his point is they're corrupt. The force of the law in the one and the princes ever raised armed in the other can rule or contain the whole. As for Republican government, Montesquieu asserts that, quote, in a popular state, there must be an additional spring, which is virtue. Virtue. Every framer of the Constitution who's written letters, who's written essays, talks about this key issue of virtue. John Adams speaks of it over and over and over again. Montesquieu goes on. What I say is confirmed by the entire body of history and is quite in conformity with the nature of things. For it is clear that less virtue is needed in a monarchy, where the one who sees to the execution of laws judges himself above the laws, than in a popular government, where the one who sees to the execution of the laws feels that he is subject to them himself and that he will bear their weight. But in a popular government, when the laws have ceased to be executed, as this can only come from the corruption of the republic, the state is already lost. The state is already lost. So what are you saying there is, you can have this beautiful republic, you can have these institutions, you can have these men and women who run these institutions, but if they lack virtue, then the republic is dead. Then it doesn't matter. In despotic government, he says, virtue is not at all necessary to it, because it's not virtuous. Montesquieu saw despotism, including its frequent antecedent, anarchy, as a continuing threat to the Republican government. He said, when that virtue ceases, ambition enters those hearts that can admit it, and avarice enters them all. Desires change their objects. That which one used to love, one loves no longer. One was free under the laws, one wants to be free against them. Each citizen is like a slave who has escaped from his master's house. What was a maxim is now called severity. What was a rule is now called constraint. What was vigilance is now called fear. There, frugality, not the desire to possess, is avarice. Formerly, the goods of individuals made up the public treasury. The public treasury has now become the patrimony of individuals. The republic is a cast-off husk. This is a famous line. The republic is a cast-off husk, and its strength is no more than the power of a few citizens and the license of all. You know, a parallel notion here is when we have a federal government where the president says, I'm going to impose a climate agreement on the American people by calling it an executive agreement and bypassing the treaty clause. Another parallel example would be a massive bureaucracy that spits out thousands and thousands of laws without any consent, any check, any balance whatsoever. Then he would argue the republic is a cast-off husk. Its strength is no more than the power of a few citizens. This is where we are today, ladies and gentlemen, and it's getting worse. This is why I'm spending time getting into this. This is one of the great thinkers and writers of the Enlightenment period. Montesquieu warned, quote, in despotic states, the nature of the government requires extreme obedience, and the prince's will, once known, should produce its effect as infallibly as does one ball thrown against another. No tempering, modification, accommodation, terms, alternatives, negotiations, remonstrances. Nothing as good or better can be proposed. In other words, it's the law of man, and this man is the prince, and he rules by the iron fist, and nothing else matters. Man is a creature that obeys a creature that wants. He can no more express his fears about a future event than he can blame his lack of success on the caprice of fortune. There, men's portion, like beasts, is instinct, obedience, and chastisement. It is useless to counter with natural feelings, respect for a father, tenderness for one's children and women, laws of honor, or the state of one's health. One has received the order, and that is enough. And I point out, yet despite man's preference for liberty, most live under tyranny. And Montesquieu explained that, quote, despite men's love of liberty, despite their hatred of violence, most people are subjected to this type of government. This is easy to understand. In order to form a moderate government, one must combine powers, regulate them, temper them, make them act. One must give one power a ballast, so to speak, to put it in a position to resist another. Now, important. This is the man who authored the notion of balance of powers, separation of powers, and checks and balances. This is important. He says, again, make them act. One must give one power a ballast, so to speak, to put it in a position to resist another. This is a masterpiece of legislation that chance rarely produces and prudence is rarely allowed to produce. A masterpiece of legislation that prudence produces and prudence is rarely allowed to produce. It's chance. That's our Constitution. So exceptional, so remarkable, so unlike anything else that mankind has ever produced. By contrast, a despotic government leaps to view, so to speak. It is uniform throughout, as only passions are needed to establish it. Everyone is good enough for that. So it follows, I point out, that virtue is mostly impossible in a monarchy and non-existent under despotism. But it's crucial to sustain a republican government. Montesquieu. Virtue in a republic is a very simple thing. It is love of the republic. It is a feeling and not a result of knowledge. The lowest man in the state, like the first, can have this feeling. However, virtue alone, I point out, is not enough. Montesquieu. Despotic government has fear as its principle, and not many laws are needed for timid, ignorant, beaten down people. But republican government requires fixed, established laws adopted by the representatives of the people, which create a culture of support for the republic, I point out. Montesquieu, quote, laws must relate to the nature, this is important, laws must relate to the nature and the principle of the government that is established or that one wants to establish, whether those laws form it as do political laws or maintain it as do civil laws. This is important. What he's saying here is the laws that are instituted, including by a Congress, must reflect the nature of the people in that society. In other words, you're not passing laws to brutalize them, to push them, to yank them, to humiliate them, to force them to do things that they don't want to do, assuming the things that are being done are humane and moral and so forth and so on. It is not the object of this, I will call it, representative government or legislature to manipulate the people, because then it ceases to be a representative republic. Montesquieu warns of the tyranny of concentrated power resulting from either unjust laws or the application of laws unjustly, and the anarchy of radical egalitarianism that leads to despotism. He wrote, quote, the principle of democracy is corrupted not only when the spirit of equality is lost, and he doesn't mean the equality of outcomes like modern-day socialism, the equality where we see every person as a human being, as an individual, with unalienable, God-given, remember, natural rights. He says the principle of democracy is corrupted not only when the spirit of equality is lost, but also when the spirit of extreme equality is taken up, and each one wants to be the equal of those chosen to command. So the people, finding intolerable even the power they entrust to the others, want to do everything themselves. He is rejecting pure democracy, or as Aristotle would call it, mobocracy. He is rejecting mobocracy. May I say in common parlance, he's rejecting populism. To deliberate for the Senate, to execute for the magistrates, and to cast aside all judges. As a result, Montesquieu observed, democracy has to avoid two excesses: the spirit of inequality, which leads to aristocracy or to the government of one alone, and the spirit of extreme equality, which leads it to the despotism of one alone, as the despotism of one alone ends by conquest. And so he's talking about moderate government, as we would call it, the middle course, constitutional republicanism. That's what he's talking about.